Blood possesses a stubborn scent that cheap drugstore bleach can never quite kill. It settles into the floorboards, lingering like rusted iron in the back of the throat. When she dug the hollow point out of his ribs, she didn't care about the ruined designer suit, the syndicate ink, or the loaded Glock resting on her kitchen table. She just wanted him off her cracked linoleum. She thought the nightmare was over, until she looked out the glass and saw 200 armed men waiting. The rain in the city didn't wash away the filth, it just made it slippery. Faye sat at her cramped laminate kitchen table, staring at a bowl of cold, sodium-heavy ramen. The fluorescent bulb overhead hummed with a dying, erratic buzz, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the peeling wallpaper of her apartment. It was 2:14 a.m. Her feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, a souvenir from a 12-hour shift at the underfunded urgent care clinic 3 blocks away. She took a bite of the noodles. They tasted like damp cardboard and salt. Then came the sound. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a heavy, desperate impact against her front door, followed by the sickening crunch of the cheap pine frame splintering. Faye froze, the plastic chopsticks slipping from her fingers and clattering against the ceramic bowl. Her heart didn't leap heroically into her throat. It plummeted into her stomach like a lead weight. Survival instinct, honed by years in a neighborhood where sirens were the local lullaby, dictated she should run for the fire escape. Her legs, however, felt like concrete. The door gave way with a final, agonizing groan. A man practically fell into her narrow hallway. He didn't burst in with the calculated grace of a cinematic villain. He stumbled, his shoulder slamming into the plaster wall, leaving a wide, wet smear of crimson in his wake. The door swung shut on its broken hinges, catching on the uneven floorboards. The apartment was suddenly filled with the smell of wet wool, high-octane adrenaline, and the unmistakable, coppery stench of fresh blood. Faye pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum. Her hand instinctively reached for the heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the stove, her breath turning shallow and ragged. The man leaned heavily against the hallway wall, his head bowed. He was massive, built with a dense, muscular thickness that seemed to swallow the dim light. He wore a dark, tailored suit that was now ruined, soaked through with rain, and something darker. Slowly he lifted his head. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and pale exhaustion. Dark hair plastered to his forehead, jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. But it was his eyes that pinned her in place. They were a flat, dead slate grey. There was no plea in them, no apology, just a raw, terrifying expectation. "Kitchen table," he grunted. His voice was a low rasp, like tires crushing gravel. "Get out," Faye said. Her voice shook. She hated that it shook. She gripped the skillet tighter, the cast iron biting into her palm. "I'm calling the cops." The man didn't smile, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He reached into his coat. Faye braced herself, raising the pan. But he didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a heavy leather-bound wallet, thick with cash, and tossed it. It hit the ramen bowl, splashing cold, salty broth onto the table before sliding to a stop near her hand. "You're a nurse," he rasped, his breathing turning wet and shallow. "Saw you patched up the kid at the corner store last month. Didn't ask questions." He knew her. The realization was a cold bucket of water over her head. He had been watching. "I'm a medical assistant. Barely," she lied, her chest tight. "And I don't do street surgery." "You do tonight!" He took a step forward, and his knee buckled. He caught himself on the edge of her counter, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips. His hand pressed against his lower left abdomen. Blood was welling between his fingers, thick and dark, dripping onto her cheap, cracked floor tiles. Faye stared at the blood. She looked at the door, then at the man. He was dying. If he died in her apartment, the police would come. If the police came, they'd look into her. They'd see the expired license, the missing fentanyl from her old job at Memorial Hospital, the quiet, desperate life she had built in the shadows. She looked back at his grey eyes. He wasn't going to leave. He physically couldn't. "Fine," Faye snapped, the word tasting like bile. She dropped the skillet. It landed with a heavy, metallic clang. "Sit on the chair, not the table. The table won't hold your weight." He grunted, pushing himself off the counter and collapsing heavily onto one of the reinforced wooden chairs. His head lolled back against the wall. Faye moved frantically but efficiently, the panic dialing down into a cold, clinical detachment. It was a defense mechanism she had perfected years ago. She wasn't saving a man, she was fixing a plumbing leak. She dragged a plastic storage bin from under her sink, kicking aside empty bleach bottles. Inside was her kit: stolen sutures, sealed scalpels, betadine, gauze, and a few ampules of local anesthetic she had squirreled away. She walked over to him, snapping on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. The latex felt tight and reassuring. "Shirt off," she ordered, her tone shifting. It was no longer the frightened tenant. It was the irritated shift worker. He managed to unbutton his jacket, his breathing growing increasingly ragged. Faye didn't wait for him to struggle with the silk shirt. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears from her kit and cut right through the fabric, tearing it away to expose the wound. It was messy, a small entry hole just below the ribs on the left side, but the surrounding tissue was bruised a violent, angry purple, swollen and taut. Blood pulsed sluggishly, thick and dark. "Looks like a 38, she muttered, probing the area with a gloved finger. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. "Bullet is still in there. There's no exit wound." "Get it out," he ground out, his eyes squeezed shut. "I don't have enough lidocaine to numb this properly," she warned him, her voice flat. "It's going to feel like I'm digging through you with a hot spoon." He opened his eyes. The grey was clouded with pain, but the stare was unyielding. "I've had worse. Do it." Faye grabbed a clean dish towel from the counter, balled it up, and shoved it toward his face. "Bite down. If you scream, my neighbors call the cops. If the cops come, I'll tell them you broke in and I stabbed you in self-defense." He took the towel, placing it between his teeth. He didn't look amused, but a faint, grim acknowledgement flickered in his expression. He gripped the edges of the wooden chair, his knuckles turning white. Faye poured a generous amount of iodine directly onto the wound. The smell of the antiseptic immediately battled with the scent of copper and sweat. She picked up the forceps. "Don't move," she said. She didn't wait for a nod. She plunged the forceps into the torn flesh. The physical act of extracting a bullet is never as clean or as fast as television suggests. It is an ugly, slippery struggle against human anatomy. Muscle tissue is dense. It fights back, contracting and spasming around the foreign object. Faye's hands were steady, but a bead of sweat rolled down her temple, stinging her eye. She blinked it away, keeping her focus entirely on the dark, welling hole in the man's abdomen. The only sounds in the apartment were the erratic buzzing of the light, the steady drumming of rain against the window, and the wet, squelching noise of metal probing flesh. The man, whoever he was a statue of agony. His massive chest heaved. A low, guttural groan vibrated in his throat, muffled by the dish towel, but he didn't pull away. The muscles in his arms were corded and rigid, trembling under the immense effort of remaining still. "Stop flexing your core," Faye barked, irritation spiking through her fear. "You're clamping down on the forceps. Breathe out." He exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing his abdominal muscles to slacken for a fraction of a second. Faye felt the metallic scrape of the forceps connecting with lead. "Got it," she murmured. She clamped down, twisting her wrist slightly to navigate the deformed bullet past torn muscle fibers. Blood surged, hot and sticky, coating her blue gloves and dripping onto his trousers. With a final, sharp pull, she yanked the instrument free. The bullet dropped into the ceramic bowl that previously held her ramen with a sharp clink. It was misshapen, flattened like a crushed coin. The man spat the towel onto the floor, gasping for air. His skin was the color of old wax. "You're not done," he rasped, his eyes rolling toward her. "I know I'm not done," Faye snapped, grabbing a handful of gauze and pressing it brutally hard against the wound to staunch the bleeding. "You're leaking like a sieve. Hold this." She forced his large, heavy hand over her own, making him apply pressure while she prepared the needle and thread. She worked quickly, drawing up what little lidocaine she had and injecting it around the ragged edges of the wound. It wouldn't do much for the deep tissue pain, but it would stop him from thrashing when she drove the needle through his skin. She threaded the curved needle. The silk suture felt unnaturally fine against the gore of the moment. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. The gravel in his voice was smoothed out by exhaustion. "None of your business," Faye replied, pushing the needle through his skin. He flinched, but remained quiet. "I'm Dante," he said. He watched her hands move. "You tie a neat knot. I used to sew up drunk frat boys in the ER. They squirm more than you do." She didn't look at his face. Looking at his face made him a person. Right now, he was just a slab of meat on her chair, a problem she needed to solve so she could bleach her floor and pretend tonight never happened. "Why aren't you in the ER anymore?" he asked. The question was casual, incongruous with the fact that he was bleeding out in a slum apartment. "Because sometimes doctors leave sponges inside people, and when nurses point it out, the hospital fires the nurse to protect the guy who brings in the money," she said, tying off a stitch and snipping the thread with a sharp click of her scissors. The bitterness in her voice was an old, familiar friend. She hated that she let it slip to a stranger. "There. 7 stitches. It's ugly, but it'll hold if you don't do any kickboxing." She began to wipe away the excess blood with a damp, iodine-soaked rag. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving behind a cold, hollow tremble in her fingers. Dante reached out. His hand, heavy and surprisingly warm despite his blood loss, wrapped around her wrist. Faye froze, a spike of genuine terror shooting up her spine. His grip wasn't tight enough to bruise, but it was an immovable restraint. He looked at her hands, smeared with his blood, then up to her face. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the cheap, frayed collar of her scrub top, the defensive set of her jaw. "You did good," he said softly. Faye snatched her wrist back. She didn't want his praise. She wanted him gone. "Keep the bandage dry," she recited, turning her back to him to strip off her gloves. The latex snapped loudly in the quiet room. "Change the dressing every 12 hours. Watch for a fever. If it gets infected, don't come back here. Go to a real hospital or a vet. I don't care." She tossed the gloves into a trash bag. When she turned back, Dante was buttoning his ruined suit jacket over his bare chest. He stood up slowly, favoring his left side, his breath hitching. He looked around her dismal apartment once, his expression unreadable, before moving towards the door. He paused at the threshold. He looked at the wallet still sitting on her table. "Keep it," he said, "for the cleaning bill." He walked out into the rain-soaked hallway. Faye waited until she heard his heavy footsteps fade down the stairwell, followed by the distant squeal of tires on wet asphalt. She walked over to the door and shoved the deadbolt into place, dragging a heavy wooden bookcase in front of it for good measure. She looked at her kitchen. Blood was everywhere. On the chair, on the floor, splashed against the baseboards. The metallic smell was suffocating. Faye sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and stared at the deformed bullet resting in her ramen bowl. She sat there until the grey light of dawn began to creep through the dusty window panes. 2 days passed. For 48 hours, Faye lived in a state of suspended animation. She went to work at the clinic. She took temperatures, drew blood, bandaged scraped knees, and smiled tight, professional smiles at the weary mothers of her neighborhood. But her skin crawled. Every time a car idled outside the clinic a second too long, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every time a shadow fell across her path, she braced herself for the impact of a bullet. She had spent hours on her hands and knees, scrubbing her apartment floor with undiluted bleach. Her hands were raw, the skin peeling and angry red, yet she could still smell the copper. She hadn't touched the thick stack of $100 bills Dante had left. She shoved the wallet into a chipped coffee canister on the highest shelf of her pantry. It felt like radioactive material. Spending it would make her complicit. It would make whatever had happened real. By Thursday afternoon, the paranoia had morphed into a dull, heavy exhaustion. She convinced herself she was being dramatic. Men like Dante, mobsters, gangsters, whatever he was, didn't care about the people they used. She was a convenient pit stop, a vending machine for stitches. He was probably dead in a ditch somewhere, or back in whatever luxury penthouse he crawled out of, having forgotten her entirely. The summer heat was oppressive as she walked home from the corner bodega, clutching a plastic bag containing a half-gallon of milk, a box of generic cereal, and a tin of cheap coffee. The air was thick, smelling of hot asphalt and rotting garbage from the overflowing dumpsters in the alley. As she turned onto her street, something felt wrong. Her neighborhood was normally a symphony of urban noise. Reggaeton blasting from open windows, the shriek of children playing near the open fire hydrant, the constant rhythmic arguments of the elderly men sitting on milk crates outside the barber shop. Today, it was silent, unnaturally, suffocatingly silent. The kids were gone. The barber shop was closed, its metal security grate pulled down and locked in the middle of the afternoon. Then, she saw them, black SUVs, not one or two. They lined both sides of the narrow, potholed street, parked bumper to bumper, stretching all the way down the block. They were massive, heavily tinted, immaculately clean machines that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of crumbling brick tenements. The low, synchronized hum of their idling engines vibrated through the soles of Faye's worn sneakers. Men were standing on the sidewalks. They didn't look like the local gangbangers who usually loitered on the corners. These men were older, carved from granite, wearing dark suits despite the 90-degree heat. They stood at parade rest, hands clasped loosely in front of them or resting casually near their lapels. There were dozens of them. Faye stopped walking. Her grip on the plastic grocery bag tightened until the plastic handles cut into her raw palms. She did a quick, panicked head count. 10 near the fire hydrant, 20 clustered around the entrance to her building, more standing across the street, watching the rooftops. There had to be at least 200 men locking down the entire city block. A sharp, hysterical laugh bubbled in the back of her throat. This is a mistake, she thought, her mind scrambling for purchase. They're looking for someone else, a rival boss, a stash house, not a broke medical assistant in apartment 3B. She tried to turn around, to walk back towards the avenue and disappear into the crowd. Miss Faye. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hum of the engines like a surgical blade. Faye froze. She slowly turned back around. A man had detached himself from the group near her building's entrance and was walking toward her. He was older than Dante, with silver hair at his temples and a neatly trimmed beard. He moved with a terrifying grace, his hands empty, his posture relaxed. The other men on the street didn't move, but their eyes all shifted to track her. He stopped a polite distance away. He wasn't smiling. "Who are you?" Faye demanded, trying to keep her voice steady, though it pitched an octave higher than normal. "My name is Carlo," the man said softly. "I apologize for the disruption to your neighborhood. We are simply ensuring the perimeter is secure." "Secure from what? We're in the middle of the day. Get off my street." Carlo ignored her command. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, elegant black card. He held it out. "Mr. Caruso requests your presence," Carlo said. The tone was perfectly polite, layered over a foundation of absolute, unyielding authority. Faye stared at the card. The name Caruso clicked into place in her mind, unlocking a box of local news headlines she usually tried to ignore. The Caruso family, extortion, port smuggling, violence that left the city morgue working overtime. "No," Faye said. She took a step back. The plastic bag slipped from her sweaty fingers. It hit the pavement with a wet slap. The plastic milk jug split open, spilling white liquid across the dirty concrete, creeping toward Carlo's polished leather shoes. "I don't do house calls," she said, her chest heaving. "I stitched him up. We're done. Tell him I said no." Carlo looked down at the spilled milk, then back up at Faye. His expression remained entirely neutral, a mask of professional apathy. "You misunderstand the nature of the request, Miss Faye," Carlo said gently. He gestured to the 200 armed men lining the street, a sea of dark suits and silent threats. "Mr. Caruso is a man who repays his debts. He owes you his life. And he has decided that your life, in turn, now belongs to him. The car is waiting." Faye stared at the puddle of milk. It was seeping into a long, jagged crack in the pavement, gathering grit and cigarette ash as it spread. Her brain latched onto the stark white against the dirty grey concrete, focusing on the mundane tragedy of spilled groceries to delay the processing of the terrifying reality surrounding her. "I have a shift tomorrow at 6, Faye said. It was a stupid, irrelevant thing to say. Her voice sounded hollow, stripped of its usual defensive edge. Carlo offered a small, polite dip of his chin. It was not a gesture of agreement, but one of placation. "Your clinic supervisor, Dr. Evans, has already been informed that you are taking an extended, indefinite leave of absence to care for a sick relative out of state. Your rent for the next 6 months has been wired to your landlord. Your utilities are paid." Faye felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and clammy despite the suffocating summer heat. They had been in her life. They had dug through her employment records, found her landlord, traced her meager footprint in the world, and systematically erased her obligations. They had removed every anchor she had to her own existence. "You can't just do that!" she breathed, her hands beginning to tremble again. She looked at the silent soldiers lining her street. 200 statues. "You can't just take people. We are not taking you, Miss Faye," Carlo said smoothly. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open rear door of the nearest SUV. The interior was cavernous and pitch black, smelling of expensive leather and heavy air conditioning. "We are relocating you. For your own safety. The men who put that bullet in Mr. Caruso are thorough. They know he didn't make it to a hospital. They are looking for the detour he took." Faye looked toward the dark maw of the vehicle. Survival instinct is a crude, unrefined thing. It doesn't care about dignity or freedom. It only cares about breathing for one more minute. The street was quiet. No police cruisers were coming. Her neighbors were hiding behind locked doors and drawn shades. She was entirely alone. She stepped over the spilled milk. She didn't look back at her apartment building. The moment she slid onto the plush leather seat, the heavy door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the humid street air and the rhythmic hum of the city. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, thick and heavy like a physical weight. The tinted windows turned the bright afternoon sun into a muted, muddy twilight. Carlo got into the front passenger seat. The driver, a broad-shouldered man whose thick neck strained against his starched collar, put the car in gear. The convoy moved seamlessly. No tires squealed, no engines roared. They glided away from the curb in unison, a long, dark serpent slithering out of the slums. Faye pressed her back against the seat, her knees drawn tightly together. The air conditioning blew a steady, icy stream across her collarbone, raising goosebumps on her bare arms. She watched her neighborhood roll by through the darkened glass. The bodegas, the laundromats, the pawn shops, places she navigated every day with a hardened, exhausted familiarity, now looked like a distant television broadcast. The convoy merged onto the highway, picking up speed. The concrete landscape of the city gradually gave way to sprawling green spaces, tall iron fences, and thick groves of manicured trees. The transition was jarring. Faye had rarely left her burrow in the last 5 years. Poverty was a geographic tether. It kept her world small. Now she was being pulled into a zip code she couldn't afford to walk through. 40 minutes later, the SUV slowed, turning onto a private, unmarked asphalt road that wound its way up a steep, forested hill. At the crest, a set of massive wrought-iron gates stood open, flanked by stone pillars and highly visible security cameras. Several armed men, wearing tactical gear rather than suits, patrolled the perimeter. The estate beyond the gates was aggressively large. It wasn't just a house, it was a compound. The main structure was built from pale limestone, with towering windows that reflected the afternoon sun like blind, staring eyes. A meticulously gravel-paved circular driveway crunched loudly beneath the tires as the convoy finally came to a halt. Before Faye could reach for the handle, her door was opened from the outside. Carlo stood waiting. "Please," he said, gesturing towards the massive double oak doors of the main entrance. Faye stepped out into the air. It smelled different here. There was no scent of exhaust or hot garbage. It smelled of damp soil, crushed pine needles, and ozone. She walked up the wide stone steps, her worn sneakers making virtually no sound. Inside, the foyer was a cavern of cold white marble and dark wood. The air was perfectly temperature-controlled, carrying a faint, clean scent of eucalyptus. It was sterile. It felt less like a home and more like a high-end mausoleum. "Follow me," Carlo instructed, walking briskly past a grand, sweeping staircase and down a wide, arched corridor. Faye followed, her eyes darting over the expensive artwork and the antique vases sitting on polished console tables. Everything was perfectly placed, immaculately dusted. It made her acutely aware of her own grime, the sweat drying on her neck, the frayed edges of her scrub pants, the lingering smell of clinical iodine clinging to her cuticles. Carlo stopped in front of a pair of heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hall. He didn't knock. He simply pushed them open and stepped aside. "He's expecting you." Faye hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her stomach churned with a nauseating mix of dread and anger. She curled her hands into tight fists, driving her fingernails into the raw flesh of her palms to ground herself, and walked into the room. The room was vast, functioning as a hybrid between a master bedroom and a private intensive care unit. Thick velvet curtains were drawn tight against the large windows, casting the space in a permanent, muted dimness. In the center sat an oversized bed with dark, heavy linens. To the right, a stainless steel medical cart stood loaded with gauze, saline bags, and sterile instruments. A portable heart monitor hummed quietly in the corner, its green line tracking a steady, rhythmic pulse. Dante Caruso was sitting up in the bed, propped against a mountain of pillows. He looked different than he had in her cramped kitchen. The grime and desperation were washed away. His dark hair was clean, combed back from his forehead. He wore a loose, unbuttoned silk pajama shirt that revealed the thick white bandages wrapping his torso. The violent bruising from the gunshot wound peeked out from the edges of the dressing, an ugly yellow and black contrast against his pale skin. He didn't look like a man who had nearly bled to death on cheap linoleum 3 days ago. He looked like a predator resting in its den. Faye stood near the foot of the bed, refusing to step any closer. The silence stretched between them, thick and contentious. She watched his chest rise and fall. It was steady. Her sutures were holding. "You're angry," Dante finally said. His voice still held that low, gravelly scrape, but it was stronger now. "I dropped my milk," Faye replied. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic she had felt on the street. It had hardened into something brittle and cold. "And I don't like being kidnapped." Dante let out a short, hollow exhale that might have been a laugh if it hadn't caught sharply in his injured side. He pressed a hand against his ribs, his jaw tightening briefly. "You're not kidnapped," he said. "You're quarantined." "There's no difference." "There is. A captive is kept for leverage. A quarantine is kept to stop an infection from spreading." His slate-grey eyes locked onto hers, entirely devoid of warmth. "The men who hit me are Russians. Bratva. They hit my car 3 blocks from your clinic. They tracked my blood trail into your alleyway." Faye felt a cold dread pool in her stomach. "You led them to me. I was losing consciousness. Your apartment was the closest door." He said it factually, refusing to offer an apology for his survival. "They know a woman in apartment 3B bought me time. My men cleared the street today because the Bratva sent scouts to your block this morning. If I had left you there tonight, you would have been tortured for my location, and then you would have been dismantled piece by piece." He spoke of violence the way a weatherman spoke of rain. Inevitable. Routine. "So you brought me here," Faye said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "To your house, where the people who want to kill you are actively trying to go. They won't get past the gates. And if they do, then we both die," he said bluntly. "But at least here, you have a fighting chance. Out there you were already dead. You just didn't know it yet." Faye stared at him. The sheer arrogance of it, the cold, logistical math he applied to her life, made her want to scream. She took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between them until she was standing directly over the side of the mattress. "Look at me," she demanded. Dante didn't flinch. He looked up, his gaze dragging slowly over her exhausted face, her tense shoulders, her white-knuckled grip on the wooden bed frame. "I am not one of your soldiers," Faye said, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "I am not part of your business. I change bedpans. I draw blood from crying children. I eat ramen out of a cracked bowl because I can barely afford my heating bill. You don't get to drag me into your war and pretend you're doing me a favor by locking me in a mansion." "I'm not pretending anything," Dante replied quietly. He didn't raise his voice to match hers. He didn't need to. "I am a pragmatic man, Faye. You saved my life. My code dictates that I protect yours. This is how I protect it. By ruining it. By prolonging it." She let out a frustrated, bitter breath, stepping back from the bed. She turned her back on him, looking around the opulent room. The silk wallpaper, the Persian rug under her feet, the antique lamps casting warm pools of light. It was beautiful. It was a cage. "How long?" she asked, not looking at him. "Until the threat is neutralized," Dante said. "Which means what? Days? Weeks?" "Until the men who ordered the hit are no longer breathing," he clarified smoothly. Faye closed her eyes. She rubbed her temples, feeling the dull throb of an impending migraine building behind her eyes. Her fingers smelled faintly of bleach and old copper. She thought of her small, dingy apartment, the broken door hinge, the dying fluorescent light. She hated that place. She had spent 5 years trying to scrape together enough money to leave it. Now she was out, and she had never felt more trapped. "I need to check your wound," she said abruptly. Dante raised an eyebrow. "I have a private physician. He was here yesterday. He said your work was crude, but effective." "I don't care what your private doctor said," Faye snapped, turning back to him. Her clinical mask slammed firmly back into place. It was the only armor she had left. "You're breathing too shallow. You're guarding your left side, which means fluid is going to build up in your lung, and you'll get pneumonia. Unbutton the shirt." For a long moment, Dante just looked at her. He studied the hard line of her mouth, the defiant tilt of her chin. There was a flicker of something in his grey eyes. Not amusement, not quite respect, but a quiet, calculating curiosity. Slowly his fingers moved to the silk buttons. He undid them, letting the fabric fall open to expose the thick white dressing. Faye walked over to the stainless steel cart. She aggressively ripped open a pair of sterile latex gloves and snapped them onto her hands. The sharp, tight sound of the latex echoed loudly in the quiet room. She grabbed a pair of surgical scissors and a fresh roll of medical tape. She walked back to the bed and leaned over him. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin. He smelled of clean linen and underlying masculine sweat. "If you tense up," she warned, her voice devoid of any bedside manner, "I will pull the tape off exactly as hard as I can." "Understood," Dante murmured. Faye began to cut the dressing. As she peeled back the thick layers of gauze, exposing the angry, bruised flesh and the black silk stitches she had tied in her kitchen, she felt his eyes on her face. He wasn't watching her hands. He was watching her. She swallowed hard, focusing entirely on the raw edges of the wound. She was in a fortress, surrounded by killers, entirely at the mercy of a syndicate boss. But in this specific, microscopic moment, with a pair of scissors in her hand and his torn skin under her fingers, she still held the scalpel. She just had to figure out how to survive long enough to put it down. Time inside the estate was not measured by the sun, but by the rotation of the men in dark suits. The morning detail wore charcoal ties, the evening detail wore black. There were no clocks in the guest wing. Faye's assigned bedroom was an expansive vault of pale cream walls and heavy, suffocating luxury. It was easily 3 times the square footage of her apartment. A massive mahogany bed sat in the center, piled high with down comforters that felt like quicksand. For the first 3 nights, she didn't sleep on the mattress. She pulled a single, crisp Egyptian cotton sheet onto the woven Persian rug at the foot of the bed and slept on the floor. She needed the hard, unyielding resistance against her spine. The softness of the room felt like a lie. It felt like a trap designed to make her forget the locked wrought iron gates outside. The worst part was the silence. Poverty was loud. Her old life was a constant, abrasive symphony of garbage trucks, domestic disputes bleeding through paper-thin plaster, and the low, rattling hum of the radiator. Here, the silence was absolute. It was an expensive, engineered quiet that pressed against her eardrums until they rang. The heavy doors sealed perfectly. The double-paned windows blocked out the wind. She felt like an insect trapped in amber. On her fourth morning, a sharp knock disrupted the stillness. A young woman in a starched uniform entered, carrying a heavy silver tray. She set it carefully on the glass coffee table. The smell of black truffles, perfectly poached eggs, and freshly baked brioche wafted upward. It was a masterpiece of culinary execution. Faye stared at it. Her stomach roiled. "Take it back," she said. Her voice cracked, dry from lack of use. The maid blinked, her hands nervously smoothing her apron. Mr. Caruso instructed the kitchen to prepare. "I don't care what he instructed," Faye interrupted, the words tumbling out sharper than she intended. She pointed to her own frayed scrub top, the same one she had washed by hand in the marble sink the night before. "I am not a guest. I don't want truffle oil. I want black coffee, a cheap burnt roast if you have it, and dry toast." The maid offered a stiff, frightened nod, picked up the heavy tray, and practically fled the room. Faye rubbed her face, pressing her palms against her eyes until bursts of static color exploded in the darkness behind her eyelids. She hated the loss of control. She hated that her anger was misdirected at a terrified staff member. She forced herself to stand, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet, and walked out into the corridor. She wasn't explicitly forbidden from roaming, but the invisible boundaries were clear. At the end of the hall, a broad-shouldered man named Leo sat perfectly still in a leather armchair. He didn't stand when she approached, but his eyes tracked her every movement. His right hand rested casually, deliberately, near the bulge under his jacket. She ignored him, turning toward the west wing, toward the makeshift hospital room. She didn't knock. She pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped inside. The air in Dante's room was heavy, smelling of sterile alcohol pads and bitter espresso. Dante was sitting up. A large leather-bound ledger was spread across his lap, and a phone was pressed to his ear. He was speaking rapid, guttural Italian. His voice was low, but it lacked the gravelly exhaustion from the night he broke into her apartment. The bruising along his jaw had faded to a sickly yellow, but the tension in his shoulders remained coiled and dangerous. He saw her enter. He didn't pause his conversation, merely tracking her with those flat, slate-grey eyes as she walked towards the medical cart. Faye snapped on a pair of nitrile gloves. The familiar, tight snap of the latex was the only thing in this house that grounded her. She grabbed the digital thermometer, a blood pressure cuff, and a fresh bottle of saline. She stood beside the bed, waiting. Dante finished his sentence, issued a final, sharp command, and hung up the phone. He tossed it onto the mattress. "You look awful," he said flatly. "I'm sleeping on the floor," Faye replied, wrapping the blood pressure cuff aggressively around his thick bicep. She pumped the bulb, watching the gauge. "Your mattress makes me feel like I'm suffocating." "The bed is orthopedic." "The bed is a sponge." She released the valve. The hiss of air filled the quiet room. 130/85. Your blood pressure is elevated. You're working too much for a man who had a bullet dug out of his liver a week ago. The bullet missed my liver by 2 inches, as you repeatedly informed me while you were digging. He watched her hands as she unwrapped a sterile thermometer. "Why are you sleeping on the floor?" "Because it's hard. Because it reminds me that I'm essentially in a very clean, very expensive prison." She shoved the thermometer toward his mouth. "Under the tongue. Keep your mouth shut." He took the plastic probe, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. His skin was warm. Too warm. Faye frowned, pressing the back of her gloved hand against his forehead. He flinched slightly at the sudden contact, his jaw tight, but he didn't pull away. He simply stared at her, his eyes unblinking, studying the dark circles under her eyes and the harsh, unyielding set of her mouth. "You're running a low-grade fever," Faye muttered, pulling her hand back. She hated the spike of genuine clinical concern that flared in her chest. He was a mob boss, a violent man. But the moment flesh turned hot and wounds threatened infection, her brain bypassed morality and locked onto the pathology. She couldn't help it. It was wired into her bones. "It's just 99 degrees," Dante said around the thermometer. "A fever is a fever. It means your body is fighting something." She pulled the probe from his mouth, checked the digital readout, and tossed it into the biohazard bin. "Sit forward. I need to check the dressing." Dante leaned forward, the muscles in his back shifting under his skin. Faye carefully peeled back the surgical tape. The incision site was red, slightly swollen, and warm to the touch. The dark silk stitches were holding, but the tissue around them was angry. "You've been moving too much," she diagnosed, her voice dipping into a stern, reprimanding tone. "You're stretching the tissue. If this tears, you're going to bleed internally, and no amount of gauze is going to save you. You need antibiotics." "I took them. You took the oral ones. You need IV Rosifin." She stepped back, stripping off the gloves. "I'll tell your private doctor to bring it when he comes tomorrow." "He isn't coming tomorrow." Faye froze. She looked up at him. "Why not?" Dante slowly leaned back against the pillows, his face an unreadable mask. "Because an hour ago, my men found his car burned out under an overpass in Queens. He's gone." The sterile air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Faye stared at him, the reality of his world crashing through the quiet illusion of the mansion. "Dead," she whispered. "Missing," Dante corrected coldly. "Which means compromised. The Bratva know he was treating me. They got to him." He looked at the medical cart, then back at her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "You're my doctor now, Faye." The shift in the estate's atmosphere was immediate and visceral. It wasn't a sudden panic. It was a cold, systematic tightening of the perimeter. The men in the charcoal ties didn't leave when the evening shift arrived. They stayed. The heavy iron gates at the bottom of the driveway were locked and reinforced with a heavy steel barricade. The thick velvet curtains across the mansion's vast windows were drawn tight, plunging the interior into a perpetual, artificial twilight. Faye stood by the medical cart in Dante's room, her hands shaking as she spiked a bag of IV antibiotics. The plastic tubing slipped in her sweaty fingers. "His doctor is gone. Burned out car in Queens." The words echoed in her skull, a rhythmic, terrifying drumbeat. She was entirely trapped now. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the sole medical lifeline for the head of the Caruso family. If he died, his men would have no use for her. If he lived, the Russians would come for her just like they had come for the doctor. "Stop shaking," Dante commanded quietly from the bed. "I'm not shaking," she lied, finally piercing the saline bag with the IV spike. She flushed the line, watching the clear liquid drip into the chamber. "Roll up your sleeve." Dante pushed the silk fabric up past his elbow, exposing the thick, dark veins in his forearm. Faye wrapped the rubber tourniquet tight, her fingers pressing into his skin with unnecessary force. She found a vein, swabbed it aggressively with an alcohol pad, and uncapped the needle. "Look away if you don't like needles," she muttered automatically. "I've been shot 3 times, stabbed twice, and beaten with a tire iron," Dante replied, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I think I can handle a 20-gauge needle, Faye." She didn't respond. She slid the steel into his vein, taped it down flat against his skin, and connected the tubing. She adjusted the drip rate, her eyes fixed on the falling droplets. Outside, the weather was turning. The thick humidity of the afternoon was breaking, giving way to a violent, rolling summer storm. Distant thunder rumbled, a deep, vibrating bass that rattled the heavy glass panes of the windows. Faye moved to the corner of the room, sinking into a leather wing-back chair. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them. She watched the IV drip. Dante watched her. "Did you have anyone back in the city?" he asked suddenly. The question cut through the silence, sharp and unexpected. "What?" "A boyfriend, family, a cat." Dante leaned his head back against the pillows. "Someone who is going to notice you vanished." "I told you I live alone," she said, her voice defensive. "My parents died when I was in nursing school. I couldn't afford the tuition, so I dropped out. No boyfriend, no pets, just a landlord who only cares that the rent clears. A ghost," Dante observed softly. "A civilian," Faye corrected, her eyes flashing with renewed anger. "I am a normal person. I go to work, I pay my bills, I try to survive. You're the ghost. You're the one bringing death into people's living rooms." Dante didn't argue. He looked at the ceiling, the harsh lines of his face shadowed in the dim light. "I didn't choose this life. I inherited it. My father built this syndicate. When he died, I had two choices. Take the seat, or let my rivals slaughter my entire bloodline." He turned his head to look at her. "Survival is rarely clean, Faye. You of all people should know that." Before Faye could retort, the lights flickered. It wasn't a slow dimming. The power cut out completely, plunging the massive room into absolute pitch-black darkness. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed down on them, broken only by the furious pounding of rain against the glass outside. Faye gasped, scrambling to her feet. "What happened? Did the storm hit a line?" "Quiet," Dante hissed. The command was sharp, lethal. 3 seconds later, the emergency generators kicked in. The room was bathed in a sickly, low-voltage red glow. The air conditioning died, leaving the air immediately stagnant. Then came the sound. It wasn't thunder. It was a sharp, distinct crack, muffled by the thick walls, but unmistakable to anyone who had lived in a rough neighborhood. A gunshot, followed by 3 more in rapid succession. Faye froze, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. Her instinct screamed at her to dive under the bed, to find a corner and make herself small. The heavy oak doors to the bedroom burst open. Carlo stood in the doorway, a suppressed submachine gun gripped tightly in his hands. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was soaked with rain, and a fresh, bleeding graze ran along his cheekbone. "The perimeter is breached," Carlo barked, his eyes darting to Dante. "They hit the eastern wall with shaped charges. They're in the gardens. We need to move you to the basement vault, now." Dante didn't hesitate. He ripped the IV needle out of his arm. Blood immediately welled up, dripping down his forearm, but he ignored it. He threw the heavy blankets off, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He reached under his pillow and pulled out a heavy, matte black Glock. "How many?" Dante demanded, standing up. He swayed slightly, his left hand instinctively clamping over his bandaged abdomen. "At least 20. Heavily armed. Professional," Carlo reported grimly. "They bypassed the outer cameras. It's a dedicated kill squad." "Faye," Dante snapped. Faye couldn't move. She stared at the gun in his hand, at the blood dripping from his arm, at Carlo's bleeding face. The sanitized illusion of the mansion was gone, replaced by the raw, metallic reality of a war zone. "Faye!" Dante yelled, the sheer volume of his voice snapping her out of her paralysis. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing her roughly by the upper arm. His grip was bruising, his hands hot and sticky with his own blood. "You stay behind me. You do exactly what I say, or you will die in this hallway. Do you understand me?" She couldn't speak. She just nodded, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Move," Dante ordered Carlo. They stepped out into the corridor. The red emergency lights cast long, demonic shadows against the marble walls. The silence of the house was entirely shattered now. The sharp, concussive sounds of automatic gunfire echoed from the lower levels, accompanied by the shattering of expensive glass and the heavy thud of boots on hardwood. Smoke began to drift up the grand staircase, the acrid, throat-burning scent of cordite and burning drywall. Dante pulled Faye along, moving with a fast, heavy limp. He kept her tucked behind his broad shoulders, his gun raised, sweeping the corners. His breathing was harsh and wet. The physical exertion was tearing at the fresh stitches in his stomach. Faye could see the dark stain of fresh blood seeping through the front of his shirt, turning the white fabric crimson. "You're tearing the wound," she whispered frantically, her medical training trying to override her terror. "It doesn't matter," Dante grunted, not looking back. They reached a hidden door disguised as a wood-paneled wall at the end of the hall. Carlo punched a code into a hidden keypad. The heavy steel door hissed open. As they rushed inside the narrow concrete stairwell, a deafening explosion rocked the mansion. The floor violently bucked beneath their feet. Faye lost her balance, pitching forward. Dante caught her by the waist, absorbing her weight, but the sudden twist of his torso exacted a brutal toll. He let out a sharp, guttural roar of agony, collapsing to his knees on the concrete landing. His gun clattered onto the stairs. "Dante!" Carlo yelled, turning back. "Close it!" Dante gasped, clutching his side. Blood was pouring freely through his fingers now, a steady, terrifying flow. Carlo slammed his fist against the emergency close button. The steel door sealed shut with a heavy, final thud, cutting off the deafening noise of the firefight above, locking them in the cold, damp silence of the subterranean vault. Faye dropped to her knees beside Dante. The red emergency light above them illuminated the horrifying reality. The entire left side of his shirt was soaked. The sutures had blown completely. He was bleeding to death. Again. And this time, there were no sterile instruments, no anesthetics, and no way out. The air inside the subterranean vault smelled of lime dust, damp foundation earth, and oxidized machine oil. The monochromatic red glare from the emergency panel didn't illuminate the dark masonry. It stained it. It turned the thick puddle of blood expanding from Dante's left side into a black, light-absorbent oil slick across the bare concrete. He didn't roll or thrash this time. His breathing had decayed into shallow, clicking gasps that signaled a lung compressing under the pressure of internal fluids. "Carlo?" Faye said. Her voice dropped into that unnaturally level, flat register people find when their world has entirely split open. "Give me your tactical belt. Now!" Carlo didn't offer a single word of hesitation. He unbuckled the thick leather from his waist and handed it over, his unblinking eyes scanning the steel seam of the reinforced door as the concrete walls vibrated with another distant, muffled, concussive impact from the floors above. Faye knelt directly in the warm slurry. The chill of the concrete floor instantly penetrated the thin cotton fabric of her scrub pants, but her nervous system barely registered the cold. She jammed her gloved fingers straight into the torn, jagged meat of Dante's side, probing blindly for the leaking artery. He buckled violently beneath her, a low, animalistic hiss ripping through his clenched teeth. His large, calloused hand clamped onto her left shoulder with enough bone-crushing force to threaten her collarbone. "Hold still," she growled, her knuckles turning chalk-white as she applied direct pressure to the hidden pumping vessel. "You blew through the deep fascia when you fell. If I don't pack this right now, you're going to be a corpse before your soldiers finish cleaning the garden above us." "Do it!" he ground out, his eyes rolling back toward the red-tinted ceiling, his jaw muscles corded like steel cables. She didn't have her professional surgical kit. She had nothing but Carlo's compact field pouch, which contained nothing more than chemical combat gauze and a basic nylon tourniquet. There was no lidocaine to numb the tissue. There were no fine silk sutures to neatly realign the flesh. This wasn't medical science. It was raw, desperate butchery designed to buy 20 minutes of life. She tore the vacuum-sealed package of hemostatic gauze open with her teeth, the bitter, chemical taste of the packaging settling instantly on her tongue. "This is going to burn like acid!" she whispered. She didn't wait for his brain to process the warning. She stuffed the kaolin-infused fabric directly into the open cavity of his abdomen. Dante's massive spine arched completely off the floor. A sound escaped him, a raw, unedited screech of pure, primeval human agony that rattled the small concrete room. His grip on her shoulder tightened until she heard the cheap fabric of her scrub top rip apart, his fingernails cutting through into her skin. She didn't flinch away from the pain. She threw her entire body weight across his pelvis, using her forearm to pin his torso to the concrete while her fingers drove more cloth into the wound, forcing the hemorrhaging to stop by sheer, unrelenting mechanical pressure. Carlo turned his head away towards the steel door, his bearded jaw working silently. Even for a man who traded daily in structural violence, the sheer, naked intimacy of this pain was too heavy to witness. "Apply pressure here," Faye gasped, her face inches from Dante's damp skin. His sweat felt icy against her cheek. She could smell the stale tobacco and bitter espresso on his breath, mixed with the rising metallic scent of his failing body. "Keep your hands flat and don't let up, Carlo." Carlo dropped to his knees, his heavy, scarred palms replacing hers, maintaining the crushing weight on Dante's midsection. Faye sat back on her heels, her breath coming in short, ragged stabs. Her hands were painted a bright, sticky crimson up to her wrists. She looked down at Dante. The syndicate boss, the man who commanded an army of 200 killers with a silent nod, was shivering like a wet street dog on a cellar floor. His lips were turning a distinct, hypoxic blue. The raw vulnerability of his massive frame made her stomach twist with a complicated knot of profound pity and white-hot rage. She hated him for dragging her into this house. She hated him for making her responsible for whether he drew his next breath. "Why didn't you leave me in the street?" she asked the quiet vault, her voice barely louder than the low hum of the air intake. "It would have been cleaner for everyone." Dante's eyelids fluttered open, the slate-grey irises dull and clouded. "A Caruso pays what he owes," he whispered, a thin, dark line of blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "You're mine to keep alive." "I'm nobody's," she said, wiping her bloody brow with her forearm, leaving a dark smear of gore across her skin. Above them, the structural thuds slowly faded into a heavy, ringing silence. The siege was ending, but inside the vault, the air remained thick with the scent of a survival that felt heavier than a coffin lid. The transition back to the surface world was entirely unceremonious. 4 hours later, the steel door hissed open with a sharp, hydraulic whine that made Faye's raw nerves spike. The red emergency glow was instantly replaced by the thin, cold blue light of a rainy dawn filtering down the concrete stairs. Leo stood at the top of the landing, his face haggard and grey. His suit jacket was missing, and his left shirt sleeve was torn away to expose a hasty, blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his forearm. He looked down into the dim vault and gave a single, stiff nod. "The house is secure," Leo reported. "The transport vehicles are waiting in the courtyard." They carried Dante out on a folding tactical stretcher. Faye walked slowly behind them, her legs feeling like lead weights, her bare feet tracking small, bloody smudges onto the white marble of the grand foyer. The mansion was completely unrecognizable. The towering limestone walls were chewed apart by automatic gunfire. The massive crystal chandelier lay shattered across the floor like a field of frozen winter ice. 3 bodies, covered in coarse grey moving blankets, lay lined up near the broken entrance doors. Outside on the gravel driveway, the 200 men were still there. But the formal discipline had evaporated. They were hyper-vigilant predators moving through the wreckage of the compound. Some swept the smoking tree line with rifles. Others loaded heavy wooden crates into the cargo bays of the idling SUVs. When Faye stepped out onto the wide stone steps, the ambient noise of the courtyard died instantly. 200 pairs of eyes shifted to her in unison. They took in the dried blood coating her clothes, the raw skin of her hands, and the hard, unyielding set of her mouth. They didn't see an accidental captive anymore. They saw the woman who had twice dragged their boss back from the edge of the grave. A heavy armored sedan rolled up to the base of the steps, its engine vibrating the air. Carlo opened the rear door. "Where are we going?" Faye asked, her voice dry and gravelly from the acrid smoke still hanging in the humid air. "A secure safe house within the city limits," Carlo said, his voice returning to that polite, formal cadence that now sounded like a threat. "Until the counter-offensives are finalized." Faye looked back at the smoking ruins of the estate, then down at her own hands. The blood had completely dried, turning a dark, flaky brown in the fine lines of her knuckles. She realized she didn't have her sneakers. She didn't have her phone. She didn't even have a name on a lease anymore. Her old life had been entirely incinerated by the muzzle flashes of a dozen rifles. She stepped into the dark interior of the car. The safe house was a penthouse loft overlooking the industrial river, a fortress of reinforced glass and brushed steel. Dante was already installed in a leather chair, a fresh unit of blood dripping into his line. The secondary medical team left after an hour, leaving Faye alone with him as the grey morning light filled the room. Faye walked to the glass wall, staring down at the city she used to live in. "You can leave if you want," Dante said from behind her. The heart monitor beeped with a slow, mechanical rhythm. "The immediate threat is dead. I can have Carlo establish you in a new state, new identity, a real clinic." Faye didn't turn around. She watched her own hollow reflection in the glass. "With your men guarding my door?" she asked quietly. "Always," Dante said, without a shred of hesitation. "You know how my syndicate bleeds, Faye. You leave my perimeter, and you become a target for anyone looking for my vulnerability." A cold, cynical laugh caught in her throat. She turned around slowly, her back against the glass, looking at the man who had dismantled her life to save his own. "So it wasn't a rescue," she said. "It was an inheritance. It was survival," Dante said, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "Here, you're protected. Here, your hands matter." Faye looked at her fingers. The raw skin was healing, but the metallic scent felt permanent. She thought of her cold ramen and her broken door frame. That life was simple, but it was over. She walked to the medical cart, her movements deliberate and devoid of any illusion. She picked up a fresh roll of gauze. "Your dressing needs changing," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, clinical line. Dante didn't smile. He just watched her, his silent ownership settling over the room like concrete. The story of Faye and Dante is a gritty reminder that survival always comes with a price tag. If you enjoyed this grounded, raw mafia romance drama, make sure to support the channel. Hit that like button right now, share this video with fellow fans of intense storytelling, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next full-length audio experience. Drop a comment below letting us know your favorite scene, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with all our latest dark romance narratives. Thank you for listening, and we will see you around very soon.